The alarms hit before I even set down my scanner. 3 sharp pulses that meant one thing on this station. Something had gone wrong in the docking ring, and it was going wrong fast. I was counting crates in Cargo Bay 4 when the lights switched from steady blue to flashing amber, and the deck under my boots gave a small shudder as something heavy slammed into the outer clamps. My name is Cale Reyes, and I had been working supply logistics on Halveron Station for almost 2 years, long enough to know that a hard dock like that only happened when a ship was running from something, or running out of time. I dropped the scanner into my belt pouch and moved toward the bay doors, and that was when the shouting started. It came from the direction of Docking Arm 7, dozens of voices layered on top of each other, some in the clipped chirps of Ashen traders, some in the low rumble of Corridon freight handlers, all of it rising into something close to panic. I broke into a run, boots hammering the deck plating, and rounded the corner just in time to see the crowd scatter. A smuggler's transport sat crooked in the clamps, one side scorched black, atmosphere venting from a crack near the hull seam in a thin white hiss. The crew were already spilling out of the airlock, coughing, stumbling, dragging each other along, and for a second I thought that was the whole story. Then something else came through the gap behind them. It moved low to the ground, shoulders first, claws scraping sparks off the deck plating, and every single person in that corridor turned and ran like the deck was on fire under their feet. I had never seen one in person before, only in briefing files, but I knew exactly what I was looking at. A Threxil cub, even young, even half-starved and shaking. It carried itself like something built for one purpose, and every alien species in this sector had learned through hard experience to fear that shape the moment they saw it. Security drones dropped from the ceiling brackets with a whine, red targeting lines sweeping the corridor, and a voice screamed over the station comms for full lockdown on Docking Arm 7. A Voss trade envoy in a hover chair spun so fast, trying to reverse, that the chair tipped sideways and dumped him against a supply rack, and he didn't even stop to right himself, just scrambled away on all 4 limbs. The cub reared back against the wall, snarling, tail lashing, cornered by drones on one side and a wall of screaming bodies on the other. Its ribs showed through patchy fur. One of its back legs dragged slightly when it shifted its weight. This was not a predator on the hunt. This was something young and terrified that had just crash-landed into the middle of a nightmare it didn't understand. My crewmate Ellen, our navigator, grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. Her 3 eyes were wide, her voice pitched high with fear. "Cale, get back," she said. "That thing kills survey teams. It doesn't stop until everything near it is dead." Behind her, our security chief, a broad-shouldered Corridon named Torvun, had his weapon half raised, hands trembling slightly, clearly running through a mental checklist that had no good ending on it. Fire on a cornered predator in a crowded corridor, and you get chaos and blood. Don't fire, and it might charge anyway. I looked past both of them at the cub, and something in me went very still and very calm, the way it used to when I was a kid back on Earth, working weekends at a rescue shelter with dogs nobody else wanted to handle. The scared ones were never the ones that wanted to hurt you. They were the ones who had already decided the whole world wanted to hurt them, and they were just trying to get there first. I set my scanner down on the deck, slow and deliberate, and stepped forward. Ellen's grip tightened. "Cale, what are you doing?" I didn't answer her, because I didn't have a good answer that would make sense to someone who grew up on a world where nothing that size and that fast had ever been anything other than a predator to run from. I just kept walking, hands open, palms out, shoulders low, not looking directly into its eyes, because staring straight on reads as a challenge to almost anything with teeth, on Earth or anywhere else. Someone behind me hissed my name in warning. A drone's targeting light swept across my chest and held there for a second before an automated safety protocol yanked it away, refusing to fire this close to a person. I kept walking. The cub's ears swiveled toward me. Its snarl faltered, just slightly, the sound catching in its throat like it wasn't sure anymore what kind of noise to make. I stopped about 4 paces away, close enough that if it lunged, I would not have time to move, and I lowered myself down to one knee, keeping my hands where it could see them. Then I whistled. It was a low 3-note call. Rising, falling, rising again. the same sound I used to bring in a nervous shelter dog from across a yard without ever raising my voice. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a threat. It was just a sound that said, "I see you, and I am not going to hurt you, and you don't have to fight anymore." The corridor went dead silent except for the faint hiss of venting atmosphere from the transport behind us. The cub's head tilted. Its ears, which had been pinned flat against its skull, came up just a little, uncertain. I whistled again, softer this time, and held my open hand out to the side, not reaching toward it, just offering the space. For a long moment, nothing happened. I could hear my own heartbeat. I could hear Torvund's weapon creak slightly as his grip shifted. Somewhere behind me, Elin had gone completely silent, which for her was its own kind of alarm. Then the cub's tail dropped, its shoulders lowered, and it took one uncertain step toward me, then another, claws clicking softly on the deck plating instead of scraping. It stopped right in front of me, close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off its thin frame, close enough to see how badly it was shaking. Then it pressed itself against my leg and curled down, tucking its head under my arm, and let out a long breath that sounded almost like relief. Nobody in that corridor moved for what felt like a full minute. I put my hand very slowly on the back of its neck, the way you would with any exhausted animal that had finally decided to trust you, and I could feel its whole body trembling, not with aggression, but with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from being alone and hunted feeling for too long. Torvund lowered his weapon an inch at a time, like he wasn't fully convinced his own arm would obey him. Ellen took a step closer, then stopped herself, staying well back. The drones hovered, uncertain, their targeting lights dimmed but not off. Someone finally spoke, one of the Ashen traders, her voice barely above a whisper. "It let him touch it," she said. "Threxil don't submit. Not ever. Not to anyone." I looked up at the small crowd that had gathered at a cautious distance, at all those wide, frightened eyes fixed on me, and the small trembling shape curled against my side, and I realized in that moment that every single one of them was looking at me like I had just done something impossible, when from where I was kneeling, it felt like the most obvious thing in the world. "It's a baby," I said. "It's alone, it's hurt, and it's more scared of all of you than any of you are of it. It wasn't hunting anyone, it was cornered." Torvund finally holstered his weapon fully, though his hand stayed near it. "That is a Threxil," he said, like the word itself explained everything. "On its home continent, it grows to the size of a transport shuttle. It hunts in packs that bring down things 3 times its own mass. There is no version of that creature that ends up gentle." "Not yet," I said. "Right now it's a scared kid, a very long way from its mother, and it just wants to know if anyone here is safe." I heard someone mutter something about how humans were strange, unsettling, wrong in a way species had never quite managed to name, and I understood exactly what they meant, even if they didn't say it directly. On most worlds, when something that could kill you shows up, the correct response is to run, or to fight, or to freeze. Somewhere along our own long road, humans had learned a third option, one most species out here had never needed and never developed, because on Earth we had spent thousands of years living right next to animals that could tear us apart. And instead of only fearing them, we had also learned how to read them, how to calm them, how to sit close enough that something dangerous would choose, on its own, to trust us instead of hurt us. It wasn't bravery, not really. It was just familiarity, with a kind of fear that most of these people had never had to sit with long enough to understand. The station medic arrived a few minutes later, a small, nervous-looking being, named Oris, who kept his instruments at arm's length the entire time he scanned the cub, refusing to get any closer than absolutely necessary. The cub tensed under the beam of the scanner, and I kept my hand steady on its neck and whistled again, low and even, until it settled. "Dehydration," Oris reported, voice unsteady. "Minor damage to the rear leg, likely from the crash. Malnourished. It has probably been alone for several days at minimum." "Days," Ellen repeated, finally finding her voice again. "Alone, on a smuggler's ship." I looked toward the wrecked transport, still venting a thin stream of atmosphere, its crew now sitting under guard a short distance away, and something cold settled into my chest that had nothing to do with fear of the cub, and everything to do with anger at the people who had put it there. They were transporting it, I said, more to myself than to anyone else. Not rescuing it, selling it. One of the smugglers, a wiry-looking trader with restless eyes, must have heard me, because he spoke up fast, words tumbling over each other, in the universal tongue everyone on the station used for trade. We found it alone, he said, orphaned. We were going to sell it to a private collector out past the trade lanes. Good money for a live specimen. Better money than most cargo runs pay in a year. It wasn't supposed to wake up until we reached the buyer. The sedative wore off early. It panicked, damaged the hold. We had to make an emergency dock or lose the whole ship. The words hit the corridor like a dropped weight. Torvund's expression darkened, and even the aliens, still keeping a nervous distance from the cub, seemed to shift their attention, just for a moment, away from the predator curled at my side and toward the people who had caged it. I looked back down at the small trembling shape pressed against my leg, and for the first time, I understood the whole shape of what had happened here. It hadn't broken free because it was dangerous. It had broken free because it was terrified, and terrified young things fight their way out of small dark spaces, whatever the cost. Because staying still feels like dying slowly, and fighting at least feels like a chance. That's not a wild predator loose on my station, I said, standing up slowly, the cub rising with me, staying pressed close against my leg, like it had decided this was now the safest place in the galaxy. That's a kidnapped kid. Nobody argued with me. Station security took the smuggling crew into custody without much resistance, since none of them were eager to test how far Torvund's patience would stretch after what they had just admitted out loud in front of half the docking ring. I stayed where I was, the cub leaning its weight against my leg, occasionally letting out a low sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a whimper, somewhere in between, the sound of something too exhausted to know which reaction it should be having anymore. Word traveled fast on a station like Halveron. By the time the medical team had set up a proper recovery space near the science wing, half the crew had already heard some version of the story, and every version somehow made it stranger than the last. By the time I walked the cub down the main corridor toward that recovery space, people were stopping in doorways just to watch, whispering to each other, some in awe, some clearly still uneasy despite the calm way the cub padded along beside me. An elderly Corridon engineer stepped just close enough to speak to me, without getting near the cub itself. I have worked cargo runs through 6 systems, he said, voice low. I have seen Threxil handlers with full restraint gear and sedation rigs lose fingers trying to move a specimen half this size. You walked it through a public corridor with your hand on its neck. I glanced down at the cub, whose ears were still pinned slightly, whose steps were still uneven from the leg injury, and who leaned into my hand every time I touched the back of its neck, like it had already decided, somewhere in that exhausted little skull, that I was the safest thing in a very unsafe world. It's not about restraint, I told him. Fear responds to fear. Calm responds to calm. It's not magic. It's just paying attention to what's actually standing in front of you instead of what you've been told to expect. He didn't look convinced, but he also didn't argue, and he kept a respectful distance the rest of the way, watching with the particular kind of caution that comes from watching something rewrite everything you thought you understood. By the time we reached the recovery space, Oris had a proper bedding area set up, soft materials layered in a corner away from bright light, food and water measured out according to whatever data the station had on Threxil physiology, which turned out to be almost nothing beyond warnings and threat assessments. Nobody out here had ever gotten close enough to a live one to learn anything gentle about them. The cub sniffed at the food cautiously, glanced up at me like it was checking whether this too was some kind of trap, and only started eating once I sat down on the floor beside it, my back against the wall, in no hurry to be anywhere else. Ellen found me there a while later, sitting quietly outside the doorway of the recovery room, watching through the observation window as the cub finally slept, curled into a tight ball, its sides rising and falling in slow, even breaths, for what was probably the first peaceful rest it had gotten in days. "You could have died out there," she said, sitting down beside me, her voice quieter than before, less afraid now, and more thoughtful. "Could have," I agreed. "Didn't. That's not an answer." I looked at her, and thought about how to explain something that felt so simple to me, and clearly did not feel simple to her at all. On my planet, I said, we spent thousands of years living right alongside animals that could have killed us without much effort. Big cats, wolves, wild horses. We didn't survive that by only running from them. We survived it by learning to read them, by learning when stillness works better than fear, by learning that panic is often the most dangerous thing in the room, more dangerous than the actual predator standing in it. Ellen was quiet for a moment, watching the sleeping cub through the glass. "And you weren't afraid," she said. "Not even a little." "I was afraid," I admitted. "I just didn't let the fear make my decisions for me." There's a difference between feeling scared and acting scared. The cub could smell one of those on me and not the other, and it needed to know which one it was dealing with. She shook her head slowly, not in disagreement, more in something closer to disbelief settling into acceptance. "Humans," she said, half to herself. "Every time I think I understand your species, something like this happens." I almost laughed. "To us it's not even unusual," I said. "It's just Tuesday." We sat there a while longer, and I noticed, not for the first time since I had come to work on this station, the particular way alien crew members had started glancing toward me differently after moments like this one, a kind of recalculation happening behind their eyes. Humanity had joined the wider community as the strange newcomers, unremarkable in most technical fields, behind in some areas, ahead in a few others, generally regarded as harmless curiosities, with an odd fondness for keeping dangerous animals close instead of far away. But every so often, something like today happened, and the recalculation shifted a little further, the quiet realization spreading that maybe harmless was the wrong word entirely, that maybe what humans actually carried with them was something closer to trust earned through generations of choosing to stand still next to danger instead of running from it. 2 days later, a full-grown Threxil arrived at the station, and the entire docking ring emptied out faster than I had ever seen it move, drones scrambling into full alert formation, security teams sealing every access point they could reach in time. She was enormous, easily 3 times the size of a transport pod, her presence alone enough to make the deck plating hum faintly under the weight of her steps, tracking signals leading her straight to the station after days of searching, straight to the sun she had lost somewhere along a smuggler's trade route. I stood at the edge of the recovery bay with the cub beside me, no longer trembling, no longer flinching at every sound, and I felt the room around us go tense in a way that had nothing to do with the cub anymore, and everything to do with the creature now filling the corridor beyond the reinforced doors. Security wanted full lockdown. I asked them to open the door instead. Nobody argued with me this time, not after what had already happened once in this docking ring. The door slid open, and the enormous shape beyond it went utterly still the moment she saw her cub standing beside a human, instead of behind reinforced glass, instead of restrained, instead of afraid. The cub let out a sound I hadn't heard from it before, something bright and eager, and crossed the space between us in a rush, pressing against its mother's side, and for a moment, the whole station held its breath, waiting to see what an apex predator does when she finds her missing child safe, calm, and clearly cared for by the last species anyone expected to manage it. She lowered her massive head, nudged the cub once, gently, checking him over the way any parent anywhere might, and then her attention shifted to me, dark eyes studying me for a long, silent moment that stretched every nerve in the corridor tight. I didn't run. I didn't reach for a weapon I didn't carry. I just stood there, hands open at my sides, and let her look. Whatever she found in that look seemed to be enough, because after a long moment, she huffed out a breath, low and rumbling, turned, and began guiding her cub back down the corridor at an unhurried pace, glancing back at me once, before the two of them disappeared from view. Ellen let out a breath beside me, like she had been holding it the entire time. Torvund didn't say anything at all, just stared at the empty corridor for a long moment, before finally holstering his weapon for good. Later, standing in the observation deck as the Threxil transport cleared the docking clamps and eased away from the station, Ellen asked me quietly what I thought that it all meant. Why a creature capable of destroying entire survey teams had chosen, in that one moment, to simply walk away in peace, instead of reacting to the human standing over her cub. I thought about it for a while before answering. Some things understand safety the moment they feel it, I said. It doesn't matter what species you are. Fear recognizes fear, and calm recognizes calm. And somewhere underneath all our differences, every living thing out here is just looking for a reason to believe it doesn't have to fight anymore. Ellen didn't say anything else after that, just stood beside me, watching the stars shift as the Threxil ship folded into the dark, and for the first time since I had come to work on this station, I felt like maybe, slowly, the rest of the galaxy was starting to understand exactly what it meant to stand next to a human who had chosen not to run.